In the northern reaches of ancient Greece, where the mountains meet the sky in jagged silhouettes and morning mist clings to valleys carved by time itself, there lay a kingdom that would birth the most extraordinary conqueror the world has ever known. Macedon stretched across landscapes of breathtaking beauty, its fertile plains rolling like green oceans beneath the watchful gaze of snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the very heavens. The air here carried the scent of wild herbs and mountain streams, while ancient forests of oak and pine whispered secrets that had been passed down through generations of kings and warriors. This was not the refined, marble-columned world of Athens or the austere military precision of Sparta, but something altogether more primal and magnificent. Macedon possessed a raw, untamed energy that flowed through its people, like the rushing waters of the Axios River that carved its way through the heart of the kingdom. The land itself seemed to pulse with an ancient power, as if the very soil had been blessed by the gods with a destiny that would shake the foundations of the known world. Golden wheat fields stretched toward distant horizons, their grain heavy with promise, while shepherds guided their flocks across hillsides painted in shades of amber and sage. In the royal capital of Pella, where cobblestone streets wound between buildings of dressed stone and timber, the palace rose like a monument to Macedonian ambition. Its walls, constructed from the finest marble quarried from nearby mountains, caught the light of dawn and held it throughout the day, creating an almost ethereal glow that spoke of divine favor. Gardens within the palace grounds bloomed with exotic flowers brought from distant lands through trade routes that connected Macedon to the wider Mediterranean world. The sound of fountains provided a constant, soothing melody that mixed with the distant calls of peacocks and the gentle rustling of olive trees planted in perfect symmetry. It was within these sacred walls, in the year 356 before the Common Era, that destiny took human form through the birth of a prince whose very arrival seemed to herald a new age. The child emerged into a world already touched by omens and portents that had been carefully observed by the court's most learned seers. On the night of his birth, lightning split the heavens with unusual frequency, and the sacred flame in the temple of Zeus Ammon burned brighter than any priest could remember. The stars themselves appeared to dance in patterns that suggested the favor of the gods, while a gentle rain fell despite the clear skies, as if the earth itself wept tears of joy. King Philip II, a man whose own accomplishments had already transformed Macedon from a regional power into a force that commanded respect throughout the Greek world, held his newborn son with hands that had wielded both sword and scepter with equal skill. The king's weathered features, marked by battles fought and victories won, softened as he gazed upon the infant who would carry forward the bloodline of the Argead dynasty. Philip had spent years building the military machine that would serve as the foundation for his son's future conquests, creating the formidable Macedonian phalanx and forging alliances that stretched across the Hellenic world. Queen Olympias of Epirus, the child's mother, possessed a beauty that was matched only by her fierce intelligence and deep connection to the mystical traditions of her homeland. Her dark eyes seemed to hold secrets of ancient rituals performed in moonlit groves, where she communed with forces that most mortals feared to approach. Olympias claimed descent from Achilles himself, that greatest of all Greek heroes, and she spoke often of dreams in which serpents and eagles appeared as guardians of her unborn child. The queen's devotion to the mystery cults, particularly those honoring Dionysus and the Cabirian deities, infused the palace with an atmosphere of divine mystery that would profoundly shape the young prince's understanding of his own destiny. The name chosen for this remarkable child was Alexander, meaning defender of men. Though few who witnessed his birth could have imagined how prophetic this designation would prove to be. From his earliest days, the infant displayed an unusual vitality and alertness that seemed to mark him as someone touched by divine favor. Palace servants spoke in hushed tones of how the child's eyes followed movement with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years, and how he rarely cried, as if already possessed of the composure that would later serve him so well on battlefields across 3 continents. As Alexander grew from infant to child, the kingdom of Macedon itself continued to flourish under his father's masterful rule. Philip's reforms had transformed not only the military, but also the very fabric of Macedonian society, creating a culture that valued both martial prowess and intellectual achievement. The palace became a gathering place for scholars, artists, and philosophers from across the Greek world, all drawn by Philip's patronage and his vision of a unified Hellas under Macedonian leadership. The sound of philosophical debates could be heard echoing through marble corridors, while poets recited verses that celebrated both ancient heroes and contemporary achievements. The natural world seemed to respond to the young prince's presence with unusual signs and wonders. Gardens bloomed more vibrantly during his walks through them. Horses grew calm at his approach, even before he learned to speak their language through touch and intuition, and wild birds would perch nearby, as if drawn by some invisible force. These phenomena did not go unnoticed by the court, where whispers began to circulate about the child's extraordinary nature and the great destiny that surely awaited him. Training grounds within the palace complex rang with the clash of bronze on bronze, as young nobles practiced the arts of war that would be essential to their futures as members of the Macedonian elite. The famous companion cavalry, Philip's elite mounted force, could be seen exercising their magnificent Thessalian horses across fields that stretched beyond the palace walls. These warriors, bound to their king by oaths of personal loyalty that transcended mere military service, represented the pinnacle of Macedonian martial culture, and their presence served as a constant reminder of the power that flowed from the royal household. Alexander's earliest years unfolded within this atmosphere of controlled power and barely restrained ambition, where every conversation carried undertones of future greatness, and every decision was weighed against its potential impact on the growing Macedonian hegemony. The child absorbed these lessons not through formal instruction, but through simple observation of the world that surrounded him, learning to read the subtle signals that passed between courtiers and to understand the complex web of relationships that held the kingdom together. His mother's stories of ancient heroes and divine interventions blended seamlessly with his father's practical lessons about the realities of power, creating, within the young prince, a worldview that encompassed both the mystical and the pragmatic aspects of leadership. Golden afternoon light would filter through tall windows as Alexander played among the treasures that his father's victories had brought to Pella, artifacts from distant lands that spoke of worlds beyond the familiar boundaries of Macedon. Persian carpets, woven with intricate patterns, lay beneath his feet, while ivory figurines from distant Africa watched over his games with expressions carved by artists who had never seen the northern mountains of his homeland. These objects served as silent ambassadors from civilizations that would one day kneel before the grown man who now crawled among them as a curious child, though none who witnessed these scenes could have predicted the scope of the destiny that was already beginning to unfold within the palace walls of this golden kingdom in the mists of ancient Greece. The young prince's destiny would be shaped not merely by the blood in his veins, but by the revolutionary vision of his father, Philip II of Macedon, whose military genius would transform the very nature of warfare and forge the foundation upon which an empire would rise. In the misty valleys and rolling hills of Macedonia, where morning fog clung to ancient oaks and the distant mountains stood like silent sentinels, Philip gazed across lands that had known only tribal warfare and fragmented loyalties, envisioning something far grander than the petty kingdoms that had preceded him. The traditional Greek warfare of his era moved with the measured cadence of ritual dance, where hoplites advanced in rigid formations across level ground, their bronze shields catching the Mediterranean sun like mirrors, reflecting ancient customs. These citizen soldiers, merchants, and farmers by trade, would gather seasonally to settle disputes in battles that lasted mere hours before returning to their olive groves and pottery wheels. Philip observed this martial theatre with the calculating eye of a master strategist, recognizing both its strengths and its fatal limitations, understanding that true conquest required not just courage, but a complete reimagining of military science. Within the forges of Pella, where hammers rang against anvils in rhythmic symphony and sparks danced through smoke-filled air, Philip's vision began to take physical form. The traditional hoplite spear, 8 feet of ash wood tipped with iron, gave way to the sarissa, a revolutionary weapon that stretched 18 feet from grip to point, its unprecedented length transforming the very geometry of battle. These massive pikes, crafted by master smiths whose calloused hands shaped destiny itself, required new techniques of forging, new methods of seasoning the wood, and entirely new approaches to metallurgy that pushed the boundaries of ancient technology. The sarissa demanded soldiers who were not seasonal warriors, but professional fighters, men whose lives revolved entirely around the art of war. Philip's recruiting officers traveled through mountain villages and coastal towns, seeking young men with the strength to wield these unwieldy weapons and the discipline to train relentlessly in their use. These recruits, drawn from farming communities where hard labor had built powerful shoulders and steady hands, found themselves transformed through months of grueling practice, learning to move as a single organism, their 18-foot pikes creating an impenetrable forest of iron points that could stop cavalry charges and devastate traditional infantry formations. The famous Macedonian phalanx that emerged from this innovation moved across battlefields like a living creature, 16 ranks deep, each warrior's sarissa angled forward at precisely calculated degrees. The front 5 ranks presented their pike points to the enemy, creating a bristling wall of death, while the rear 11 ranks held their weapons aloft, the forest of wooden shafts deflecting arrows and providing psychological intimidation that could break enemy morale before battle was even joined. This formation advanced with mechanical precision, each step measured, each breath synchronized, the bronze and iron fittings of their equipment, creating a metallic symphony that announced the approach of unstoppable force. Yet Philip's genius extended far beyond the sarissa and the phalanx, encompassing innovations in siege warfare that would revolutionize the conduct of military campaigns. The traditional Greek approach to fortified cities involved lengthy blockades, waiting for starvation or disease to force surrender. But Philip commissioned the construction of massive siege engines that could breach walls directly. Towering wooden towers on wheels, protected by bronze plates and carrying dozens of archers, rolled across ancient battlefields like moving fortresses, while battering rams swung from iron chains, their bronze-capped heads pounding against stone walls that had stood for centuries. The sound of these siege engines at work created a terrible music of conquest. The rhythmic hammering of rams echoing across valleys, the creaking of rope and timber under enormous tension, the shouts of engineers coordinating the deployment of catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds over defensive walls. Philip's siege specialists, many recruited from the engineering traditions of Asia Minor, brought knowledge of mathematics and physics that transformed warfare from art to science, calculating trajectories and structural stress points with precision that amazed and terrified their contemporaries. Behind these technological marvels stood Philip's most crucial innovation, the creation of a professional military establishment that could sustain year-round campaigns. Previous Greek armies disbanded after harvest season, their farmer soldiers returning to tend crops and repair winter damage to their homes. But Philip's forces remained in the field through all seasons, their loyalty purchased with regular pay and the promise of plunder from successful conquests. These professional soldiers, freed from agricultural concerns, could march hundreds of miles without losing cohesion, establishing camps with engineering precision and maintaining their equipment to standards impossible for part-time warriors. The logistics of maintaining such forces required administrative systems of unprecedented complexity, with supply trains stretching across mountain passes and coastal routes, carrying not just food and replacement weapons, but the specialized tools and materials needed to maintain siege engines and manufacture ammunition. Philip's quartermasters, drawn from merchant families experienced in long-distance trade, organized supply networks that could feed 20,000 men and their animals while operating hundreds of miles from Macedonian territory, their wagons and pack animals creating dusty columns that stretched for miles across ancient landscapes. This professional military machine enabled Philip to conduct campaigns of unprecedented duration and complexity, reducing Greek city-states one by one with methodical precision that left no opportunity for seasonal recovery or diplomatic maneuvering. The siege of Olynthus demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Philip's innovations, as his siege engines systematically demolished walls that had protected the city for generations, while his phalanx formations prevented any hope of relief forces breaking through to assist the defenders. The psychological impact of Philip's military revolution extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, creating a climate of fear and inevitability that preceded his armies like an advance guard. Ambassadors from threatened cities would arrive at foreign courts with tales of the Macedonian war machine, describing siege towers that dwarfed defensive walls and phalanx formations that moved with supernatural coordination, their reports spreading terror more effectively than any military campaign could achieve through force alone. Within Macedonia itself, Philip's military innovations created profound social transformation, as traditional tribal hierarchies gave way to merit-based promotion systems within the professional army. Young men from remote mountain villages could rise to positions of command through demonstrated skill and courage, their advancement creating new bonds of loyalty that transcended ancient clan rivalries and regional divisions. The shared experience of training and campaigning forged a national identity that had never existed before, turning fractious tribal warriors into citizens of an expanding empire. The wealth flowing into Macedonia from successful conquests funded further military innovations, as Philip invested captured treasure in improved weapons manufacturing, better siege equipment, and expanded training facilities. The royal workshops of Pella hummed with constant activity, where craftsmen experimented with new bronze alloys and iron working techniques, their innovations spreading throughout the growing empire and establishing technological standards that would influence military development for centuries to come. As Philip's conquests accumulated, from the gold mines of Mount Pangaeus to the strategic ports of the northern Aegean, each success provided resources for the next campaign while demonstrating the irresistible power of his military system. The young Alexander, growing to manhood within this atmosphere of constant victory and expanding power, absorbed lessons about warfare and leadership that would shape his own legendary campaigns. Watching his father transform Macedonia from a peripheral kingdom into the dominant force of the ancient world, through the systematic application of military genius and unwavering strategic vision. The death of Philip II in 336 BCE sent tremors through the carefully constructed edifice of Macedonian power, like a great stone cast into still waters. The assassination came at the height of a wedding celebration, a moment of triumph transformed into chaos as the king's blood pooled upon the marble floors of the palace. In the sudden vacuum of authority, ambitious nobles whispered in shadowed corridors, their voices carrying the weight of conspiracy and opportunity. The empire Philip had forged through decades of brilliant warfare and diplomatic cunning now hung suspended between order and dissolution, awaiting the hand that would either steady it or watch it crumble. Alexander stood at the threshold of his destiny, a youth of 20 whose golden hair caught the flickering light of torches as he moved through the palace halls where his father's body lay in state. The prince possessed an intensity that seemed to emanate from within, his pale eyes holding depths that suggested both the dreamer and the destroyer. Those who had watched him grow from boy to young man recognized something extraordinary in his bearing, a quality that transcended mere royal blood and spoke of forces greater than inheritance or tradition. His education under Aristotle had filled his mind with visions of distant lands and philosophical concepts, while his training in the gymnasium had hardened his body into an instrument of war. Now, as he prepared to claim his birthright, these two streams of preparation would merge into something the world had never seen. The coronation itself unfolded with ancient ceremony, but beneath the ritual pageantry lay currents of uncertainty and calculation. Noble families whose loyalty Philip had commanded through strength and success now weighed their options in the face of an untested king. The crown of Macedon, heavy with gold and responsibility, settled upon Alexander's brow like a burden accepted rather than a prize claimed. His first acts as monarch revealed the steel beneath his youthful exterior: swift executions of his father's enemies, strategic marriages to cement alliances, and proclamations delivered with a voice that carried across the great hall with surprising authority. The transition from prince to king had been accomplished not through gradual assumption of power, but through a single decisive leap that left no room for doubt or challenge. Word of Philip's death travelled with the speed of wind across water, reaching every corner of the Greek world within days. In Athens, where the memory of Marathon and Salamis still burned bright in the collective consciousness, aged orators rose in the assembly to speak of freedom restored and Macedonian tyranny ended. The silver-tongued Demosthenes, Philip's greatest enemy among the Greeks, proclaimed the dawn of a new age as crowds gathered in the agora to hear news of their oppressor's demise. Thebes stirred with particular violence, its citizens remembering too well the humiliation Philip had inflicted upon their once proud city. From the islands of the Aegean to the mountain fastnesses of Aetolia, Greek communities began to envision themselves free from the northern yoke that had pressed so heavily upon their necks. The rebellion that followed erupted like a fever through the Greek peninsula, spreading from city to city with infectious enthusiasm. Ancient rivalries were temporarily set aside as communities that had warred against each other for generations now found common cause against the Macedonian threat. In marketplaces and temples, citizens spoke openly of the boy king who surely lacked his father's iron will and military genius. Ambassadors travelled between cities, weaving webs of alliance and mutual support, while weapons were gathered and militias drilled in preparation for the coming storm. The very air seemed charged with possibility, as if the gods themselves had decided to grant the Greeks one final chance at independence. Alexander's response to this defiance revealed the depths of strategic thinking that would define his reign. Rather than rushing headlong into battle, he first secured his northern borders, moving with lightning speed against the barbarian tribes that pressed constantly against Macedonia's frontiers. His army swept through Thrace like a scythe through grain, crushing resistance so thoroughly that the defeated chieftains could only marvel at the precision and ferocity of their conqueror. These campaigns served multiple purposes. They tested Alexander's leadership in actual combat, seasoned his troops for the greater challenges ahead, and demonstrated to any who doubted that the new king possessed military talents equal to his father's legacy. The march south began in the early days of spring, when the mountain passes had cleared of snow and the roads could support the weight of a moving army. Alexander led from the front, his presence visible to every soldier in the long column that wound its way through the familiar landscapes of northern Greece. The Macedonian phalanx moved with the disciplined precision Philip had instilled, their sarissas gleaming in the morning sun like a forest of deadly spears. Behind them came the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen whose loyalty to their young king approached the devotional, their horses snorting clouds of steam in the cool air as they maintained formation across the rolling hills. The speed of Alexander's advance caught the Greek rebels completely unprepared for the reality of war. Cities that had proclaimed their independence with such fervour now found themselves faced with the grim prospect of siege and destruction. The psychological impact of the king's presence proved as devastating as any military tactic. Here was no distant boy ruler sending orders from a palace, but a warrior king who shared the dust and danger of the campaign trail with his men. Messengers raced ahead of the advancing army, carrying news that struck terror into the hearts of those who had so recently celebrated their liberation from Macedonian rule. At Thermopylae, that narrow pass made sacred by Spartan blood, Alexander paused not for battle, but for ceremony. The young king stood where Leonidas had made his final stand against the Persian hordes, perhaps contemplating the cyclical nature of conquest and resistance that defined the relationship between Greece and its enemies. The moment passed quietly, without fanfare, but those who witnessed it understood they were seeing history fold upon itself. The descendant of northern barbarians paying homage at the shrine of Greek heroism before continuing his march to crush Greek rebellion. The siege of Thebes began not with the thunder of siege engines, but with the somber deployment of troops around the city's ancient walls. Alexander's forces took their positions with methodical precision, surrounding the rebellious city like hunters closing in on cornered prey. The Thebans, trapped within their fortifications, could only watch as their enemies prepared for an assault that would determine not just their city's fate, but the future of Greek resistance to Macedonian power. Days passed in tense standoff, with negotiators moving between the camps in increasingly desperate attempts to find some middle ground between submission and annihilation. When the assault finally came, it erupted with violence that seemed to shock even the veterans who had fought under Philip in his bloodiest campaigns. The walls of Thebes, built by generations of skilled craftsmen and strengthened by centuries of warfare, crumbled before the concentrated fury of Alexander's siege engines. Macedonian soldiers poured through the breaches like water through a broken dam, their battle cries echoing off the stone buildings as they swept through streets their fathers had walked as conquerors decades before. The fighting continued from dawn until dusk, transforming a city that had once rivaled Athens in power and prestige into a landscape of smoke and ruin. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world that reverberated far beyond the immediate military consequences. This was not merely the defeat of a rebellious city, but the obliteration of a symbol, the erasure of a community whose name had been synonymous with Greek independence and resistance to foreign domination. The survivors, sold into slavery or scattered as refugees across the Mediterranean, carried with them tales of destruction so complete that other Greek cities began to reconsider the wisdom of resistance. The young king, who had seemed so vulnerable just months before, had proven himself capable of ruthlessness that exceeded even his father's reputation for harsh justice. In the aftermath of Thebes' fall, Alexander's clemency toward other Greek cities demonstrated a political sophistication that belied his years. Athens, which might have expected the same fate as Thebes, instead received pardons and assurances of protection. The contrast was deliberate and calculated, mercy following closely upon the heels of merciless destruction, creating a psychological dynamic that made submission seem not just prudent, but magnanimous. The League of Corinth, that confederation of Greek states nominally allied to Macedonia, reconvened with renewed enthusiasm for supporting their northern overlords' ambitions. The flames that had consumed Thebes still smouldered in the Greek imagination when Alexander turned his gaze eastward, across the narrow waters that separated Europe from Asia. The Hellespont stretched before him like a liquid boundary between worlds, its dark currents carrying the dreams and ambitions of countless generations who had gazed upon its shores. This ancient waterway, no wider than the flight of an arrow at its narrowest point, had witnessed the passage of heroes and gods in the old stories, and now it would witness the crossing of a young king whose destiny lay written in the stars above Persia's golden cities. The preparations for this monumental crossing unfolded with the methodical precision that would become Alexander's hallmark throughout his campaigns. Along the beaches of Sestos, the Macedonian fleet assembled like a forest of masts and sails, their wooden hulls creaking softly against the gentle waves. The sight of 360 vessels drawn up along the shore created a panorama of organized power, each ship carefully provisioned for the journey that would carry 35,000 men into the heart of an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the distant Indus. The air thrummed with the constant activity of final preparations, the loading of supplies, the checking of weapons, the quiet conversations of soldiers who stood on the threshold of adventure beyond their wildest imaginings. As dawn painted the waters of the Hellespont in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander performed a ritual that would echo through the centuries. Standing at the prow of his flagship, the young king poured a golden libation into the sacred waters, honoring Poseidon, lord of the seas, and calling upon the gods to smile upon this enterprise that would reshape the world. The wine, mixed with the salt water, created patterns that seemed to dance with prophetic meaning. And those who watched felt they were witnessing not merely a military crossing, but a sacred passage into legend. The oars struck the water in unison, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of history's heart, and the great fleet began its journey across waters that had known the ships of Troy and the vessels of Xerxes. The Asian shore rose before them, like a new world emerging from the mists of morning. Its hills, clothed in the green of early spring and crowned with the ruins of ancient cities. When Alexander's feet first touched the soil of Asia, he thrust his spear deep into the earth and declared the continent won by the favor of the gods, a gesture both theatrical and profound that captured the audacious scope of his ambitions. The landing proceeded with remarkable smoothness. The Persian satrap Arsites, having withdrawn his forces rather than contest the crossing directly, perhaps hoping that the vast distances and countless armies of the empire would prove sufficient to contain this upstart from the margins of civilization. The first test of Alexander's genius came swiftly, at the river Granicus, where the assembled forces of Asia Minor's Persian governors awaited him like a glittering wall of steel and silk. The river ran clear and cold between its banks, lined with Persian cavalry, whose armor caught the sunlight like scattered jewels, while behind them stood the disciplined ranks of Greek mercenaries, whose presence added bitter irony to this clash between East and West. The Persian commanders had chosen their position with care, believing that the young Macedonian would never dare assault a defended river crossing against such overwhelming numbers. But they had not reckoned with the fire that burned in Alexander's heart, or the devotion that bound his men to his cause. The battle that followed became the first masterpiece in Alexander's long gallery of tactical brilliance, a symphony of movement and violence that announced to the world that a new force had arrived on the stage of history. Alexander led the charge himself, his white plume visible above the chaos as he drove his horse Bucephalus straight into the heart of the enemy line, his lance finding its mark again and again as his companions followed in his wake like an avalanche of bronze and iron. The clash of weapons rang across the water, while the cries of men and horses mingled with the thunder of hooves on the riverbank, creating a terrible music that spoke of empire building and destiny fulfilled. The Persian resistance crumbled beneath the relentless pressure of the Macedonian attack, their carefully ordered ranks dissolving into fleeing fragments as Alexander's tactical genius and personal courage combined to create victory from what had seemed an impossible assault. The flower of Persian nobility lay scattered along the banks of the Granicus, their gilded armor now tarnished with blood and mud, while the Greek mercenaries who had served their cause met a grimmer fate, captured and condemned to labor in the mines as traitors to the Hellenic cause. The spoils of victory were sent back to Athens as a reminder of Alexander's power and a promise of the greater glories to come. With the Granicus behind him, Alexander's army swept through the cities of Asia Minor like a spring flood, carrying away the accumulated debris of decades. Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, opened its gates without resistance, its Persian garrison melting away before the advancing Macedonians like snow before the warming sun. The city's treasures, accumulated over generations of Persian rule, filled Alexander's war chests and provided the financial foundation for the campaigns that lay ahead. The local populations watched with wonder and growing hope as the young king proclaimed the restoration of their ancient laws and the ending of Persian taxation, transforming conquest into liberation with the political wisdom that marked all his greatest achievements. The siege of Miletus demonstrated another facet of Alexander's military genius, as he combined land and naval operations to reduce this proud city that commanded the approaches to the Aegean. The massive walls that had defied countless previous attackers proved insufficient against the methodical application of Macedonian siegecraft, while the Persian fleet found itself outmaneuvered and ultimately scattered by Alexander's superior tactics and unshakable determination. When the city finally fell, Alexander's treatment of the defeated population revealed the magnanimity that would become another hallmark of his reign, sparing those who submitted while making examples of those who continued to resist. Halicarnassus, seat of the formidable Queen Ada and fortress of the Persian naval commander Memnon, presented Alexander with his greatest challenge yet in Asia Minor. its massive fortifications and skilled defenders promising a siege that would test every aspect of his military machine. The city's walls, strengthened by Persian engineering and defended by seasoned troops, rose from the rocky peninsula like a stone challenge to Macedonian ambitions. For weeks, the siege engines thundered against the ancient stones, while sappers worked in the darkness below, their patient tunneling gradually undermining the foundations of Persian power in this crucial stronghold. The fall of Halicarnassus marked the effective end of organized Persian resistance in western Asia Minor, leaving Alexander master of the Aegean coastline and free to turn his attention to the greater prizes that lay deeper in the Asian heartland. The captured cities yielded not only wealth and supplies, but also invaluable intelligence about the empire that stretched endlessly eastward, its roads and rivers, its fortresses and armies, its strengths, and the fatal weaknesses that Alexander's keen mind was already beginning to perceive and exploit with the patient calculation of a master strategist. As winter approached, and the campaigning season drew to its close, Alexander established his winter quarters in the ancient city of Gordium, that legendary place where an ancient knot had waited for centuries for the hand destined to loose it. The young king had crossed the narrow waters that separated two continents, and in a single season had shattered the Persian hold on Asia Minor, transforming himself from a Macedonian prince into a conqueror whose name was already beginning to echo through the halls of Persian palaces and the councils of distant satraps, who now understood that the world had changed forever. The momentum of those early victories in Asia Minor carried Alexander's forces deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire, where the winds of destiny would soon converge on two battlefields that would reshape the ancient world. Having secured the Aegean coastline and established his reputation as a commander who could not be turned back, the young Macedonian king pressed eastward through the rugged terrain of Anatolia, his army now seasoned by combat and strengthened by the confidence that comes from facing the unknown and emerging victorious. The Persian king Darius III, meanwhile, had not remained idle in his distant palaces. Reports of the Macedonian advance had reached Persepolis and Babylon, carried by swift messengers who spoke of fallen cities and scattered Persian forces. The great king, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean, began to gather the vast resources at his command. From the satrapies came levies of warriors representing dozens of nations and cultures, their weapons and armor reflecting the diversity of the Persian realm. Curved swords from Bactria, powerful bows from Persia proper, war chariots from the eastern provinces, and the feared scythe chariots that had broken enemy lines in battles past. As autumn settled over the eastern Mediterranean in 333 BCE, these two forces, one compact and disciplined, the other massive and diverse, moved toward an inevitable collision near the narrow coastal plain of Issus. The town itself was unremarkable, a modest settlement where the mountains pressed close to the sea, creating a natural corridor between the highlands of Anatolia and the Levantine coast. But geography had chosen this place for greatness, and the narrow confines of the battlefield would prove decisive in ways that neither commander could have fully anticipated. Alexander had pushed his forces southward along the coast, expecting to meet the Persian army in the broader plains further south, where Darius could deploy his superior numbers to maximum effect. But the Persian king, perhaps influenced by advisors who underestimated the Macedonian tactical flexibility, had moved his enormous host northward to position himself behind Alexander's line of advance. When scouts brought word that the Persians had occupied the coastal plain near Issus, Alexander found himself in the unusual position of having his enemy between his army and his supply lines, a situation that would have dismayed most commanders, but seemed only to sharpen the young king's appetite for battle. The morning mist still clung to the Panaris River when the two armies began their deployment, the narrow battlefield forcing Darius to compress his vast forces into a space that negated much of his numerical advantage. The Persian center bristled with the elite immortals, 10,000 warriors whose ancestors had conquered Babylon and Egypt, their scaled armor catching the early light like the hide of some primeval beast. On their flanks stretched long lines of infantry drawn from across the empire, while the famous Persian cavalry took position on the wings, though the confined space left little room for the sweeping maneuvers that had made them legendary. Alexander's response to these constraints demonstrated the tactical genius that would become his trademark throughout the Great Campaign. Rather than attempting to match the Persian deployment, he concentrated his strength in an oblique formation that would allow him to strike with maximum force at a single point, while refusing engagement along most of the line. The companion cavalry took their positions on the right wing, their long lances bright with bronze points, while the disciplined phalanxes of Macedonian infantry anchored the centre, their sarissas creating a forest of spear points that seemed to stretch endlessly skyward. The battle began with a thunderous crash of bronze on bronze, as the opposing forces met along the banks of the shallow river. Persian arrows darkened the sky in whistling clouds, while the Macedonian artillery replied with bolt throwers and catapults that sent their missiles deep into the crowded Persian ranks. The sound of combat rolled across the plain like thunder, punctuated by the screams of wounded horses and the shouted commands of officers struggling to maintain formation in the chaos of melee. But it was Alexander himself who provided the decisive moment, leading the companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly toward the position where Darius commanded from his war chariot. The sight of the Macedonian king, his bronze armor gleaming and his white-plumed helmet unmistakable, even in the dust and confusion of battle, created a psychological shock that rippled through the Persian ranks. As the cavalry wedge smashed through the Persian left wing and drove toward the royal standard, panic began to spread among the great king's forces. The collapse, when it came, was as sudden as it was complete. Darius, seeing the Macedonian cavalry bearing down on his position and witnessing the disintegration of his left wing, abandoned his chariot and fled the field on horseback. The sight of the great king's flight sent waves of dismay through the Persian ranks, transforming an organized retreat into a catastrophic rout. Thousands of Persian soldiers threw down their weapons and fled toward the mountain passes, while others attempted to surrender, only to be trampled in the chaos. In the aftermath of Issus, Alexander found himself master not only of a great victory, but of prizes beyond imagination. The Persian royal camp, abandoned in Darius's hasty flight, contained treasures that dazzled even the Macedonians who had grown accustomed to the wealth of conquered cities. Gold vessels, precious stones, elaborate tapestries, and chests filled with darics, the gold coins that bore the image of the Persian king, all fell into Macedonian hands. But more valuable than gold was the capture of Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and daughters, hostages whose safety would complicate the Persian king's strategic options in the campaigns to come. Yet Darius himself had escaped, and with him, the hope of Persian resistance. The great king retreated to Babylon and then to the eastern provinces, gathering new forces and preparing for another confrontation. He sent envoys to Alexander, offering enormous ransoms for his family and vast territorial concessions. But the young Macedonian king had tasted the intoxicating possibility of total victory and would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. 2 years would pass before the armies met again, years that saw Alexander complete his conquest of the Levant and Egypt, adding the ancient kingdoms of Phoenicia and the land of the pharaohs to his growing empire. But always his thoughts turned eastward, toward the heart of Persia, where Darius waited with a new army even larger than the one that had fallen at Issus. The Persian king had learned from his defeat, consulting with Greek mercenary commanders, and studying the tactical innovations that had brought him low. The next encounter would take place on ground of his choosing, in the broad plains of Mesopotamia, where his superior numbers could be deployed without the geographical constraints that had doomed him at Issus. The site chosen for this climactic confrontation was near the ancient city of Gaugamela, in a region where the flat terrain stretched endlessly in all directions under the burning Mesopotamian sun. Here, in October of 331 BCE, Darius had assembled what many historians would later call the greatest army ever fielded by the Persian Empire. From India came war elephants, their massive forms draped in armor and carrying towers filled with archers. From the steppes came nomad horsemen, whose skills with bow and lance had been honed by generations of warfare on the grasslands. The scythed chariots, their wheels fitted with razor-sharp blades, waited in long lines to charge into the Macedonian phalanx and shatter its disciplined ranks. Alexander approached this ultimate test with the confidence born of unbroken victory, but also with a mature understanding of the stakes involved. Defeat here would mean not merely the end of his Asian adventure, but the probable destruction of his army, far from any hope of rescue or retreat. The night before battle, he spent long hours in consultation with his officers, refining the tactical plan that would pit Macedonian discipline and innovation against the raw power and diversity of Persian arms. With the dust of Gaugamela still settling across the Mesopotamian plains, Alexander's thoughts turned southward toward the ancient land of the pharaohs. The great Persian army lay scattered like leaves before an autumn wind, and Darius had fled once more into the eastern reaches of his crumbling empire. Egypt beckoned, that mystical realm where the Nile carved its eternal path through golden sands, where monuments older than memory stood sentinel against the desert winds, where gods walked among mortals and pharaohs claimed divinity itself. The march south unfolded like a dream across landscapes that seemed to shimmer between reality and legend. The Macedonian phalanx moved through territories where every stone held stories, where the very air seemed thick with the weight of countless centuries. Palm groves swayed in gentle breezes that carried the scent of exotic spices and incense, while villages of mud brick and weathered stone watched the passage of this northern king who had toppled the mighty Persians with such devastating ease. Children peered from doorways with wide, curious eyes, and elders nodded with the wisdom of those who had seen many conquerors come and go, yet sensed something different in this golden-haired youth who rode at the head of his disciplined ranks. The Egyptian satrap Mazaces understood the shifting winds of fortune better than most. When word reached him of Gaugamela's outcome, when reports filtered south of Persian garrisons laying down their arms without a fight, he made the choice that would spare his province the devastation of siege and battle. The gates of Memphis opened wide, and the ancient capital welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians had grown weary of Persian rule, weary of foreign gods imposed upon their sacred temples, weary of tribute flowing northward to distant Persepolis, while their own traditions withered under foreign neglect. Alexander entered Memphis in the manner of a pharaoh returning to his rightful throne. The great procession wound through streets lined with cheering crowds who threw flower petals and scattered grain in the path of their new ruler. Priests emerged from temples that had stood for millennia, their white linen robes brilliant in the fierce Egyptian sun, their faces marked with the serene dignity of men who served gods older than the mountains. They performed the ancient rituals of welcome, burning sacred oils that filled the air with clouds of sweet-smelling smoke, chanting invocations in the hieroglyphic tongue that few beyond the temple walls could comprehend. The young king moved through these ceremonies with the reverence of one who understood that he stood in the presence of something far greater than mere political conquest. Here in this land where the Great Pyramid had already been ancient, when his ancestor Achilles fought beneath the walls of Troy, Alexander felt the weight of eternity pressing upon his shoulders, like a mantle of stars. The priests recognized something in him that transcended the usual ambitions of military commanders, a genuine respect for the divine mysteries that had sustained Egypt through countless dynasties and foreign occupations. It was in Memphis that the idea first took root, growing in Alexander's mind like a seed planted in the fertile soil of the Nile Delta. The priests spoke of Ammon, the great god of the western desert, whose oracle at the oasis of Siwa had guided pharaohs and heroes since time immemorial. They told stories of the sacred rams, whose curling horns symbolized divine power, of the hidden sanctuary where the god himself spoke to mortals, brave enough to undertake the perilous journey across the burning sands. Herodotus had written of this place, Pindar had sung of its mysteries, and Perseus himself was said to have consulted the oracle before his great adventures. The decision, when it came, surprised none of Alexander's companions, who had learned to read the subtle signs of their king's restless ambition. While his generals expected a swift march eastward to pursue the fleeing Darius, Alexander announced his intention to found a new city at the mouth of the Nile, a great port that would bear his name and serve as a gateway between the Mediterranean world and the ancient wisdom of Egypt. But even as work began on Alexandria, even as surveyors laid out the broad streets, and architects planned the great lighthouse that would guide ships safely to harbour, Alexander's gaze kept drifting westward toward the trackless expanse of the Libyan desert. The journey to Siwa began with all the careful preparation that such an expedition demanded. Water had to be cached along the route, guides familiar with the desert's treacherous moods had to be secured, and provisions calculated with the precision of a military campaign. Yet, there was something different about this march. Something that set it apart from the calculated conquests that had brought Alexander from the banks of the Granicus to the throne of the pharaohs. This was a pilgrimage in the truest sense, a journey undertaken not for territory or treasure, but for something far more elusive. The confirmation of a destiny that Alexander had begun to sense stirring within his own soul. The desert embraced the small expedition with its vast silence, its endless expanses of sand that shifted and reformed themselves with each breath of wind. The sun blazed overhead like a bronze shield, its heat creating phantoms that danced on the horizon, mirages of lakes and palm trees that vanished the moment one tried to approach them. At night, the temperature plummeted with startling suddenness, and the stars emerged in their countless multitudes, so bright and numerous that they seemed close enough to pluck from the velvet sky like luminous fruit. Days blended into one another in the rhythm of desert travel. The early morning departure, when the air still held a hint of coolness. The long hours of steady progress across landscapes that seemed to exist outside of time. The grateful rest during the blazing heat of midday, when even the hardiest travelers sought whatever shade could be found. Alexander rode often at the head of the column, his eyes fixed on the western horizon, as if he could see through the shimmering heat to the sacred oasis that lay somewhere beyond the visible world. The oasis of Siwa appeared like a jewel set in an endless expanse of gold and amber sand. Palm trees rose in graceful clusters, their fronds whispering secrets to the desert wind, while springs of clear water bubbled up from hidden depths to create pools that reflected the brilliant sky above. The settlement itself seemed to exist in a different realm from the harsh world of the surrounding desert. Gardens flourished in the sheltered groves, date palms heavy with fruit provided shade for wandering paths, and the air itself seemed cooler, touched with the moisture that made all life possible in this remote sanctuary. The priests of Ammon had been expecting him. Perhaps word had travelled ahead through the mysterious networks that connected desert tribes across vast distances, or perhaps the god himself had whispered of the approaching visitor in the sacred dreams that guided the oracle's visions. They emerged from the ancient temple with measured steps, their robes white as clouds against the deep green of the oasis palms, their faces bearing the serene composure of men who had spent their lives in communion with the divine. The temple itself was older than memory, its stones weathered by countless centuries of desert wind and scorching sun. Hieroglyphs covered the walls in intricate patterns that told stories of gods and heroes, of the eternal cycles of death and rebirth that governed all existence. The sacred ram, symbol of Ammon's power, gazed down from carved reliefs, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, while the scent of burning incense hung heavy in the shadowed chambers, where generation after generation of pilgrims had come seeking guidance from the god who ruled over the hidden places of the earth. Alexander entered the sanctuary alone, as tradition demanded. The priests led him through passages that grew progressively narrower and darker, past alcoves where oil lamps flickered like captured stars, past walls covered with images that seemed to move and shift in the dancing light. The sound of his own breathing echoed softly in the enclosed space, mingling with the distant whisper of wind through the oasis palms and the soft murmur of the priests' chanted prayers. What passed between Alexander and the oracle in that innermost sanctum remained forever sealed within the young king's heart. When he emerged from the temple, his companions noted a change in his bearing, a new gravity, a deeper sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from him like heat from glowing bronze. The priests bowed low as he passed, their faces reflecting the awe of men who had witnessed something beyond ordinary human experience. The journey back across the desert unfolded in contemplative silence, as if the entire expedition had been transformed by whatever revelation had taken place within the sacred chambers. Alexander rode with his eyes fixed on distant horizons, his thoughts clearly dwelling on matters far removed from the immediate concerns of military campaigns and political administration. The oracle's words, whatever they might have been, had planted seeds that would grow and flourish in the fertile ground of his boundless ambition, shaping the course of all his future conquests and the very conception of his own divine destiny. The desert sands of Egypt still clinging to their cloaks, Alexander and his army turned their faces eastward once more, drawn by the inexorable pull of conquest that had become as essential to them as breath itself. The oracle's words at Siwa had settled into his consciousness like sediment in still water, the divine proclamation echoing in the chambers of his mind as the great military machine began its ponderous movement across the ancient landscapes of the Near East. Behind them lay the fertile delta of the Nile. Ahead stretched the vast expanses of Asia, territories that had known the tread of Persian armies, but had never felt the disciplined step of Macedonian phalanxes. The march through Syria and Mesopotamia unfolded like the pages of some epic scroll, each day bringing fresh vistas of conquest and consolidation. Cities opened their gates before the approaching storm of bronze and leather, their governors weighing the futility of resistance against the mercy that might be shown to those who submitted without bloodshed. The army moved with the confidence of an organism that had learned to feed on victory, its component parts functioning with the precision of a well-tuned instrument of war. Veterans shared their bread with newer recruits, teaching them the subtle arts of survival that could not be learned in any gymnasium or training ground, while the baggage trains stretched behind them like the tail of some enormous serpent, carrying the accumulated wealth of conquered empires. As they pressed deeper into the heartland of the Persian Empire, the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of ancient history. These were the roads that had carried the chariots of Cyrus and Darius, the highways along which tribute had flowed from distant satrapies to the golden palaces of Persepolis. Now, those same routes bore the measured tread of Macedonian boots, the creak of siege engines, and the low murmur of conversations conducted in the rough dialect of northern Greece. Alexander himself rode among his men, sometimes at their head, sometimes moving through their ranks like a thread weaving through cloth, his presence a constant reminder of the divine destiny that drove them all forward into the unknown. The Hindu Kush mountains rose before them, like the spine of the world itself, their snow-capped peaks disappearing into clouds that seemed to brush against the very roof of the sky. Here was a barrier that had turned back armies since time immemorial. Ranges so vast and forbidding that they had served as the natural boundary between civilizations, the place where the ambitions of conquerors traditionally came to rest against walls of stone and ice. The local guides spoke in hushed tones of the dangers that awaited any who dared to attempt the crossing, their weathered faces bearing the lines that came from generations of watching the mountains claim the lives of the unwary. Yet, Alexander gazed upon those towering heights with the same expression he had worn when contemplating the walls of Tyre or the desert approaches to Siwa. The impossibility of the task seemed only to feed the fire that burned within him, that restless energy that had driven him from the modest kingdom of his father to the very edges of the known world. His engineers studied the passes with the methodical attention of men who had learned to see opportunity where others perceived only obstacle, their minds already turning to the practical problems of moving an entire army through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain traveler. The ascent began in the grey hours before dawn, when the air still held the bitter chill of the high places, and the stars seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. Column after column of soldiers began the long climb, their breathing growing labored as the thin air filled their lungs with each step. Pack animals struggled under loads that had seemed manageable in the lowlands, their eyes rolling white with the strain of navigating narrow ledges where a single misstep would send both beast and burden tumbling into the abyss below. The sound of their passage echoed from peak to peak, a percussion of hoofbeats and marching feet that announced to the world that Alexander's army feared no barrier, respected no boundary that geography might place in their path. Days blended into nights as they wound their way through passes that seemed to lead not merely to another country, but to another world entirely. The familiar landscapes of the Mediterranean basin lay far behind them now, separated not just by distance, but by the fundamental transformation that came with crossing such a threshold. Here, the very quality of light seemed different, filtered through air so clear and thin that distant peaks appeared to float like mirages against the crystalline sky. The soldiers moved with the careful deliberation of men who understood that they had entered a realm where the usual rules no longer applied, where the margin between life and death could be measured in the security of a single handhold or the reliability of a weathered rope. Alexander himself seemed to draw strength from the harsh grandeur of the mountains, as though the physical challenge awakened something primal within him that had been dormant during the easier victories of the coastal campaigns. He could be seen at all hours moving among his men, sharing their hardships without complaint, his presence a constant reminder that their king asked nothing of them that he was not willing to endure himself. When pack animals collapsed and had to be abandoned, he helped redistribute their loads among the soldiers. When the cold became so intense that water froze in their vessels, he was among the first to break the ice with his own hands. The descent from the high passes brought them into valleys where the air itself seemed to carry new fragrances, scents that spoke of different flowers, unfamiliar trees, and the rich earth of regions that had never known the Mediterranean sun. Here were rivers that flowed not toward the familiar seas of their homeland, but eastward, toward waters that existed only in the tales told by merchants and the speculations of philosophers. The very birds that wheeled overhead were different, their calls adding new notes to the symphony of sounds that accompanied the army's passage through this transformed landscape. As they entered the plains of what would one day be called Afghanistan, the soldiers began to encounter peoples whose customs and languages bore no resemblance to anything they had known. These were not the familiar enemies of the Greek world, not Persians or Egyptians or Phoenicians, but something entirely other. Warriors whose tactics had been shaped by generations of mountain fighting, whose allegiances followed patterns that seemed to shift like the shadows cast by moving clouds. Here was a land where loyalty was measured not in gold or territory, but in the ancient currencies of honor and blood debt, where a treaty signed in the morning might be forgotten by evening if the wind changed or an augury proved unfavorable. The very geography seemed to conspire against traditional methods of warfare, offering endless opportunities for ambush and retreat. Valleys that could hide entire armies, ridges that commanded views across vast distances. Alexander's tactical genius faced challenges unlike any he had encountered in the more ordered landscapes of the West, requiring adaptations that pushed both his strategic thinking and his understanding of human nature into entirely new territories. His maps, carefully drawn by the best cartographers of the Greek world, proved useless in a region where the relationships between peoples mattered more than the positions of cities, where the true boundaries were drawn not by rivers or mountain ranges, but by the invisible lines that separated one tribal confederation from another. Yet, with each mile that passed beneath their feet, with each challenge overcome through a combination of force and diplomacy, the army grew not weaker, but stronger, not more dispersed, but more unified. The shared hardships of the mountain crossing had welded them into something more than a military force, had transformed them into a brotherhood bound together by experiences that no one who had not walked those high passes could fully understand. They carried within themselves now not just the memory of victories won in familiar lands, but the profound knowledge that they had passed beyond the edges of their old world, into something vast and strange and full of possibility. The Indian subcontinent lay before them now, stretching away toward horizons that seemed to promise wonders beyond even Alexander's fevered imagination. Lands where elephants walked like living fortresses, and rivers ran with gold. Where the very air was said to be thick with spices, and the trees bore fruit unknown to Western palates. Behind them, the Hindu Kush stood like a wall, sealing off their retreat, ensuring that their only path lay forward, deeper into the mysterious heart of Asia, toward confrontations and discoveries that would test every assumption they had ever held about the nature of the world and their place within it. The dust of the Hindu Kush still clung to the bronze and leather of Macedonian armor as Alexander's army descended into the fertile valleys of the Indus. But something profound had begun to shift within the young king himself. Where once stood a Macedonian prince schooled in the classical traditions of Aristotle, there now walked a figure transformed by the vast distances and diverse peoples he had encountered. The Alexander who emerged from the mountain passes bore little resemblance to the warrior who had crossed the Hellespont 8 years before, his golden hair now touched with premature silver, his eyes holding depths that spoke of kingdoms seen and conquered, of gods appeased and cultures absorbed. In the palace tents that followed the army's movements, Persian carpets lay beneath Macedonian furniture, while Indian incense burned alongside offerings to Greek deities. Alexander moved through this fusion of worlds with the fluid grace of one who had learned to be many things to many peoples. When he received Indian Raja delegations, he wore silk robes that caught the light like captured starfire, his movements deliberate and measured in the manner of Eastern potentates. Yet when his Macedonian commanders sought audience, the familiar purple cloak appeared, and the voice that addressed them carried echoes of Philip's court and the rolling hills of Pella. This was no mere political theatre, but the emergence of something unprecedented in the ancient world, a ruler who had begun to transcend the boundaries that had traditionally defined kingship itself. The transformation manifested most clearly in the daily rituals that governed Alexander's court. Where once the informal camaraderie of Macedonian military tradition had prevailed, elaborate ceremonies now unfolded with clockwork precision. Visitors from distant provinces prostrated themselves according to Persian custom, while Greek philosophers debated the divine nature of kingship in hushed tones. Alexander himself seemed to inhabit multiple identities simultaneously, shifting between roles with an almost supernatural ease that left observers wondering which version represented his true self. To the Egyptians, he remained the son of Ammon, blessed by ancient gods whose temples had stood when Greece was still wilderness. To the Persians, he had become the legitimate heir to Cyrus and Darius, ruling by the same divine mandate that had once elevated their greatest kings. The physical spaces Alexander inhabited reflected this metamorphosis with striking clarity. His travelling pavilion had evolved into something resembling a portable palace, its silk walls adorned with maps that showed not just conquered territories, but projected realms stretching beyond the known world. Persian artisans worked alongside Greek craftsmen, creating furniture and decorative objects that blended traditions in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The very air within these spaces seemed different, heavy with the perfumes of a dozen lands, and the whispered conversations of courtiers who spoke in languages that ranged from Macedonian Greek to Sanskrit. Alexander moved through this multicultural tapestry with the confidence of one who had not merely conquered diverse peoples, but had somehow absorbed their essence into his own being. His relationship with his army revealed the complex tensions inherent in this transformation. The grizzled veterans who had followed him from Macedonia found themselves serving a king who seemed increasingly foreign, his concerns extending far beyond the traditional bounds of Greek ambition. Where once Alexander had shared their meals and their dangers with easy familiarity, he now dined in splendor that rivaled the great kings of Persia, surrounded by advisors whose faces and customs were alien to men raised in the rough democracy of Macedonian military culture. Yet these same soldiers recognized that their king's evolution was inextricably linked to their unprecedented success. that his ability to become all things to all peoples had opened doors that purely military conquest could never have breached. The intellectual dimensions of Alexander's transformation proved equally profound. The boy who had once absorbed Aristotle's teachings about the natural superiority of Greeks over barbarians now governed an empire where such distinctions had become meaningless. His court attracted scholars, artists, and philosophers from every corner of the known world, creating a cosmopolitan, intellectual environment that would have been impossible under traditional Greek models of kingship. Indian mathematicians discussed their revolutionary concept of zero with Babylonian astronomers, while Persian magi debated the nature of divine light with followers of Plato. Alexander presided over these exchanges, not merely as a patron, but as an active participant, his mind shaped by years of exposure to ideas and worldviews that challenged every assumption of his Macedonian upbringing. The administrative structures he established reflected this new understanding of universal monarchy. Rather than simply imposing Macedonian systems on conquered territories, Alexander created hybrid institutions that drew from the best elements of each culture he encountered. Persian satrapies operated alongside Macedonian military districts, while local customs and laws remained in force wherever they did not conflict with imperial stability. This was governance on a scale and complexity that dwarfed anything the ancient world had previously known, requiring a ruler who could think beyond the narrow confines of tribal or city-state loyalty. Alexander had become not merely a conqueror, but an architect of a new form of political organization that would influence imperial structures for millennia to come. His personal relationships underwent similar transformation, reflecting the broader evolution of his royal identity. The casual friendships of his youth gave way to carefully calibrated alliances that served both personal and political purposes. His marriage to Roxana represented more than romantic attraction. It symbolized the union of East and West that he sought to embody in his own person. When he later encouraged mass marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen, he was implementing a vision of cultural synthesis that went far beyond mere diplomatic expediency. These unions were meant to create a new aristocracy that would be neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something entirely novel, a ruling class that could govern his universal empire with understanding born of shared heritage. The religious dimensions of Alexander's transformation perhaps revealed most clearly the depth of his metamorphosis from Macedonian prince to universal monarch. Where traditional Greek kings had served as high priests of their local cults, Alexander now claimed divine status that transcended all cultural boundaries. In Egypt, he was Pharaoh, son of Ra and Ammon. In Babylon, he inherited the sacred responsibilities of Mesopotamian kingship that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. Among the Persian nobles, he embodied the divine glory that had legitimized a Achaemenid rule for 2 centuries. This was not mere political calculation, but a genuine attempt to create a religious synthesis that could unite his diverse subjects under a single, sacred canopy. The artistic expressions that flourished under his patronage captured this revolutionary vision with remarkable clarity. Sculptures combined Greek naturalism with Persian grandeur and Indian spiritual intensity, creating works that belonged fully to no single tradition, yet somehow embodied the essence of all 3. Architecture followed similar patterns, with buildings that incorporated elements from every corner of the empire, while achieving an aesthetic unity that spoke to Alexander's vision of universal harmony. These artistic achievements were not mere decoration, but tangible expressions of a new form of civilization that Alexander was actively creating through the force of his transformed personality. As the seasons turned and the great army continued its eastward march, observers noted that Alexander seemed increasingly comfortable in his role as universal monarch, as if the boy from Pella had always been destined for this cosmic transformation. The rough edges of Macedonian kingship had been polished away by exposure to ancient wisdom and sophisticated court traditions, leaving behind a ruler who embodied the best qualities of every culture he had encountered. Yet beneath this magnificent exterior, something of the original Alexander remained, visible in moments of spontaneous generosity or flashes of tactical brilliance that recalled his origins as a student of both Aristotle and Philip. The transformation was complete, but it had not erased the foundation upon which it was built. Rather, it had elevated that foundation to unprecedented heights, creating a monarch whose vision encompassed not just the known world, but realms of possibility that extended beyond the horizon itself. The weight of empire settled upon Alexander's shoulders, like a mantle woven from the threads of 100 conquered nations. By his 32nd year, the young Macedonian, who had once dreamed of matching Achilles, had become something far more complex than any hero of legend, a living bridge between worlds that had never known each other's existence. The dust of countless battlefields clung to his cloak, yet beneath the accumulated grime of conquest lay the purple silk of Persian royalty and the golden threads of Egyptian divinity. He had transformed from a Greek warrior into something the ancient world had never seen, a universal monarch whose authority stretched from the marble columns of Macedonia to the spice-scented ports of India, from the wind-swept steppes of Scythia to the sun-baked sands of Libya. The palace chambers of Babylon echoed with the whispered consultations of astronomers and generals, their voices mixing the dialects of a dozen lands as they pored over maps that depicted an empire so vast that its edges seemed to blur into myth. Alexander moved among these counselors like a restless spirit, his eyes carrying the peculiar intensity that had driven him across 30,000 miles of conquest. The fever of ambition that had once burned bright and clear had evolved into something more complex, a flame that flickered between the rational calculations of statecraft and the intoxicating dreams of limitless expansion. Plans crystallized in the humid air of Mesopotamian nights, campaigns that would push beyond the boundaries of the known world into territories where geography itself became legend. The Arabian Peninsula beckoned from beyond the marshes and palm groves, its interior a tantalizing blank space on the crude maps spread across marble tables. Merchants from the southern reaches spoke in hushed tones of frankincense forests and pearl-diving waters, of cities built from coral stone where queens ruled over kingdoms older than recorded memory. Alexander's generals watched their king trace routes across these theoretical landscapes with the same finger that had once pointed toward the Hellespont, recognizing in his gestures the familiar hunger for horizons that lay perpetually beyond reach. The mathematics of logistics filled papyrus scrolls with calculations of supply lines and garrison strengths, while in the deeper chambers of his mind, Alexander contemplated realms that existed somewhere between ambition and dream. Westward, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, lay another ocean entirely, one that ancient geographers claimed wrapped around the edges of the world like a cosmic river. The very idea of such waters stirred something primal in Alexander's imagination, the notion that conquest might finally encounter its natural boundary, not in the resistance of enemies, but in the physical limits of creation itself. His admirals, bronzed by years of Mediterranean sun and scarred by battles fought on everything from Phoenician triremes to Indian river barges, found themselves commissioned to study the feasibility of expeditions that would dwarf even the crossing into Asia. The shipwrights of Babylon worked with cedar brought down from Lebanon and bronze cast in furnaces that glowed like earthbound stars, crafting vessels designed to carry Macedonian ambitions across waters that might stretch beyond the edge of maps. Yet beneath the grand planning and the measured consultations with engineers and navigators, something darker moved through the corridors of power. Alexander's body, which had endured wounds that would have killed lesser men, began to whisper its own quiet rebellion against the endless demands of empire. Scars from Indian arrows throbbed in the humid Mesopotamian climate, while deeper injuries, those inflicted not by enemy weapons but by the weight of absolute authority, manifested in moments of brittle silence that fell across royal audiences like shadows across sundials. The king, who had once shared his soldiers' bread and slept under the same stars, now moved through chambers hung with silk and cooled by slaves wielding peacock feather fans. Yet distance had crept into his relationships, like winter into a mountain valley. The evening banquets grew longer and more elaborate, their tables groaning under the weight of delicacies gathered from every corner of the known world. Persian wines mingled with Egyptian beer and Scythian kumis, while musicians played instruments whose exotic scales carried melodies from the far reaches of the empire. Alexander reclined among cushions stuffed with Arabian cinnamon bark, his purple-dyed fingers lifting golden cups filled with libations that sparkled like liquid jewels in the light of 1,000 oil lamps. These gatherings had become more than mere celebrations. They served as a kind of communion with the vastness of his achievement, each exotic flavor and foreign melody a tangible reminder of territories brought under Macedonian rule. The night that would become his last began like countless others, with the low murmur of conversation drifting through chambers perfumed with burning myrrh. Alexander moved among his companions with the easy grace of a man who had learned to carry authority as naturally as armor, his laughter joining the gentle splash of fountains that cooled the night air with their eternal music. Wine flowed from amphoras, marked with the seals of distant vineyards, each vintage carrying within its depths the essence of soils that had never known foreign conquest until Alexander's armies had passed across them like a transforming storm. The hours dissolved in a haze of fellowship and reminiscence, stories of battles fought and cities taken, mixing with philosophical discussions that would have been equally at home in Aristotle's academy or beneath the desert stars of Gedrosia. As the night deepened, Alexander felt a strange heaviness settling into his limbs, as though the accumulated weight of empire had suddenly materialized as physical burden. The golden cup slipped from fingers that had once gripped sword hilts through the chaos of 20 major battles, its contents spreading across marble floors in patterns that seemed to mirror the branching rivers of maps spread across nearby tables. His companions watched with growing alarm as their king, this man who had seemed to transcend the normal limitations of mortality through sheer force of will, struggled against an enemy that could not be charged with cavalry or overcome through tactical brilliance. The fever came like a tide, washing over Alexander's consciousness in waves that carried him alternately toward delirium and moments of startling clarity. In those lucid intervals, he spoke of campaigns yet to be fought and cities yet to be founded, his voice carrying the same ring of certainty that had once convinced 30,000 Macedonians to follow him beyond the edge of the known world. Physicians summoned from across the empire gathered around the royal couch like moths drawn to a dying flame. Their remedies ranging from traditional Greek bloodletting to exotic Persian herb lore and Indian breathing techniques that promised to rebalance the body's essential forces. For 11 days, the fever ebbed and flowed through Alexander's system like a slow poison, each cycle leaving him weaker than the last. The palace filled with the rustle of silk robes and the soft tread of sandaled feet, as courtiers and generals moved through corridors that seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of news that would reshape the world. Messages flew out from Babylon on swift horses, carrying reports that would eventually reach every corner of an empire suddenly faced with the unthinkable prospect of existing without the force of will that had called it into being. The golden throne that had been carved to accommodate the proportions of a living god sat empty in the great hall, its vacancy more ominous than any omen read from the flight of birds or the patterns of sacrificial entrails. On the 10th day of Daisios, in the 36th year of his age and the 13th year of his reign, Alexander breathed his last in the same city where Nebuchadnezzar had once dreamed of hanging gardens that would rival paradise itself. The chamber fell silent, save for the eternal whisper of fountains and the distant murmur of a great city going about its evening business, unaware that the force that had reshaped the ancient world had just flickered out like a candle in a sudden wind. Outside the palace walls, the Euphrates continued its ancient flow toward the Persian Gulf, its waters carrying within their depths the same indifference to human ambition that had watched empires rise and fall since the first cities lifted their walls toward the star-scattered sky. The great bronze doors of the palace in Babylon swung closed for the final time on the 10th day of June, in the year 323 before the Common Era, as the breath departed from the body of Alexander of Macedon. The empire that had stretched from the wine-dark waters of the Adriatic to the distant reaches of the Indus River from the windswept steppes beyond the Caspian Sea to the sun-baked sands of Libya, suddenly found itself without its singular animating force. In the hushed chambers where incense still burned and servants moved like shadows, the most extraordinary military mind the world had ever known lay still at last, his restless spirit finally at peace after 32 years of relentless ambition and conquest. The news travelled as swiftly as the wind across the vast territories Alexander had claimed, carried by mounted messengers who rode hard through mountain passes and across endless plains, their horses' hooves drumming out a rhythm of finality on ancient roads. In Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt that bore his name, scholars in the great library paused in their copying of scrolls, their reed pens suspended in mid-stroke, as they absorbed the magnitude of what had transpired. The lighthouse that guided ships safely to harbour continued its eternal vigil, its flame flickering in the Mediterranean breeze, but the hand that had commanded its construction would never again point toward new horizons to conquer. Within hours of Alexander's death, the carefully constructed unity of his empire began to fracture like pottery struck by a hammer. The Macedonian nobles who had followed him across 3 continents gathered in urgent council, their voices echoing through marble corridors as they debated the succession. Outside, in the streets of Babylon, Persian merchants and Greek soldiers, Egyptian scribes and Scythian horsemen, all the diverse peoples who had been bound together under Alexander's banner, sensed the approaching chaos with the instinct of animals before a storm. The great melting pot of cultures that Alexander had envisioned, where East and West would blend into something magnificent and new, trembled on the edge of dissolution. The generals, those weathered veterans who had shared tent and battlefield with their king, found themselves thrust into roles they had never sought. Ptolemy, the careful strategist, cast his gaze toward Egypt, where the Nile's annual flood promised stability and wealth. Seleucus looked eastward to the vast satrapies of Asia, where fortunes waited among the trade routes that connected distant lands. Antigonus surveyed the highlands of Anatolia, while Cassander's thoughts turned homeward to Macedonia, where Alexander's mother, Olympia, waited like a serpent coiled to strike. Each man carried within him a fragment of Alexander's vision, but none possessed the magnetic force of personality that could hold such disparate pieces together. The partition of the empire unfolded like the slow collapse of a great building, each stone falling in its appointed place. Treaties were signed and broken with the changing seasons, and the map of the known world was redrawn again and again in the blood of those who had once marched as brothers. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from this dissolution carried within them the seeds of Alexander's grand design, but they were pale reflections of the unified vision he had pursued. In Egypt, the Ptolemies built a dynasty that would endure for 3 centuries, their capital Alexandria becoming a beacon of learning and culture. The Seleucid Empire sprawled across Asia, a bridge between Greek and Persian traditions that would survive in various forms until the legions of Rome finally extinguished its flickering flame. Yet, even as the political structure of Alexander's creation crumbled, something more enduring took root in the fertile soil of human imagination. The stories of his deeds spread beyond the boundaries of his former empire, carried by traders along the Silk Road, by sailors across the wine-dark sea, by travelers who gathered around campfires under star-filled skies to speak of the young king who had dared to challenge the gods themselves. In India, where he had turned back at the Hyphasis River, bards began to weave tales of Sikander, the great conqueror from the west, into their epic songs. Persian storytellers remembered Iskandar, the 2-horned one, who had reached the ends of the earth and drunk from the fountain of life. The cities Alexander had founded became lasting monuments to his vision, their Greek columns rising against foreign skies like declarations of a shared human heritage. In Bactria, far to the east, Greek theatres echoed with the words of Sophocles and Euripides, while local artisans learned to carve marble in the classical style. The marriage of cultures that Alexander had championed through his own example continued in these distant outposts, creating hybrid forms of art and thought that would influence civilizations for millennia to come. Buddhist sculptures bore the faces of Greek gods, while Persian garden designs influenced the layout of Greek agoras. The Great Library of Alexandria became the repository of human knowledge, drawing scholars from across the known world to study beneath its soaring columns. Here, the geographical knowledge Alexander's expeditions had gathered was preserved and expanded, creating maps that would guide explorers for centuries. The botanical specimens his followers had collected bloomed in carefully tended gardens, while the astronomical observations made during his eastern campaigns helped establish the true size and shape of the Earth. The fusion of Greek rational inquiry with the accumulated wisdom of ancient Eastern civilizations produced advances in mathematics, medicine, and natural philosophy that would echo through the halls of learning until the Renaissance. As generations passed, and the immediate political consequences of Alexander's death faded into history, the legend began to overshadow the man himself. Medieval chroniclers, writing by candlelight in monastery scriptoriums, embellished his story with miraculous elements, transforming the Macedonian king into a figure of romance and wonder. The Alexander romance, translated into dozens of languages, carried tales of his adventures to every corner of the known world, from the courts of Charlemagne to the markets of Baghdad, from the monasteries of Ethiopia to the halls of Viking jarls in distant Scandinavia. In the deepening twilight of antiquity, as the last Hellenistic kingdoms fell to the expanding power of Rome, Alexander's true achievement became clear. He had not merely conquered territories or accumulated treasure, though he had done both on an unprecedented scale. Instead, he had fundamentally altered the course of human development, creating connections between distant peoples that would never again be completely severed. The Greek language became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, allowing ideas to flow freely across cultural boundaries. The common currency he had established facilitated trade that linked the Atlantic shores of Iberia with the Indian Ocean ports of the subcontinent. The dream of universal empire that had driven Alexander across the known world would inspire conquerors and visionaries for centuries to come. Roman generals studied his campaigns, Napoleon carried accounts of his battles on the march to Egypt, and even in modern times, military strategists pass his tactical innovations with the devotion of scholars examining sacred texts. Yet perhaps his greatest legacy lay not in the techniques of warfare, but in the radical notion that diverse peoples could be united not merely by conquest, but by the sharing of culture and the recognition of common humanity. As the centuries rolled past like waves upon a distant shore, the dust settled over the ruins of Persepolis and grass grew between the stones of ancient Babylon, but the echo of Alexander's footsteps continued to resonate through the corridors of time. The young king, who had wept for want of new worlds to conquer, had, in his brief passage across the stage of history, expanded the very definition of what it meant to be human, showing that the barriers between East and West, between civilized and barbarian, between the familiar and the foreign, were not walls ordained by the gods, but boundaries that courage and vision could transcend. In the end, Alexander had conquered something far more enduring than cities or kingdoms. He had conquered the human imagination, and there his empire would reign eternal, undiminished by the passing of ages, as timeless as the stars that had guided his armies across the vast expanses of the ancient world.